here's what I've noticed about relationships. They don't usually heal on their own. Time can soften the sting, but it cannot repair the fracture. Healing takes a lot of humility, a lot of honesty, a lot of forgiveness, and very often God's grace working where we cannot work. So welcome back to People Are the Worst, God's answer to messy relationships. I'm Sandy, and today we're figuring out exactly how we can restore relationships. That's our goal. It's such an important part of our lives, this whole restoring relationships, because we have to do it over and over and over again. We actually have to get good at it because it's inevitable that our relationships are going to struggle at times. But healing is possible. And the question is how, as I'm saying, and I'm here again with my friend, my pastor, our relationship expert, Mark Shoup. And we're talking about what it looks like to begin restoring what's been lost, what's been broken. So, and my first question to you is the obvious one. Mark, when a relationship feels strained, where does healing begin?
Well, thanks again, Sandy, for allowing me to be with you. It's good to be with you. I think it goes back to probably something we touched on in the earlier podcast, and that is that I think the healing starts with having a deep down desire to want to see healing in the relationship. Because as we talked about before, it's like if really deep down we don't want to heal the relationship, we don't want to see it, become a more healthy, vibrant relationship, then we're not going to do what's going to be required for us to get to that point. So I think it starts with that desire. And then I think the next step, if you want to look at it in a step like sequence, would be we have to bring God into the midst of it. I think anything, not just relationships, but I think anything in our life, I always think of, Matthew 11, where Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. Well, that's pretty much all of us. We are heavy. We are burdened by different things, and relationships, especially relational strife, relational conflict is something that does burden us. It does consume us at times. And so I think we follow the invitation of Jesus, and we come to him. We come to him with the issue. We come to him with the problems, but we also come to him. I think what you said earlier is that, it requires a heart of humility. And so I think we've got to come to him with an openness to say, okay, Lord, I want to see healing in this, but I also at the same time, I need to be open to what you're going to show me. I need to be open to what maybe this other person that I have the conflict with, what they might say. There may be some truth in what they are saying. Am I open to hearing that? That's that humble posture. And it's interesting because in that Matthew 11 verse, I've always been amazed by this. It's one of the few places in Scripture where Jesus describes himself. And he goes on to describe himself, and he says, "I am gentle and humble in heart." And it's that posture of humility. That what he wants us to come to him with, I think what he wants us to go to another person with in relationship is what he modeled to all of us, and that is that humility.
I feel like that's such an important message when you say that Jesus described himself as gentle and lowly, and what was it?
Humble in heart. Yeah.
Sorry. Gentle and humble in heart. When he described himself as gentle and humble in heart, if we could actually do that, our relationships would just flourish. And I wonder if we could actually get to that point where we approach every relationship in that way, because sometimes it feels like, there's a big divide when there's a broken relationship. It's not just one thing or one thing that was said or one action that was taken, but it's many things.
Yeah.
It's a course over time where the relationship just breaks down and the gap becomes so big, we're really at a loss and we can't really imagine crossing it.
Mm-hmm.
What does taking a first step look like when you're on two different sides of a canyon? And, what does it look like to take that first steps?
Yeah.
And what are some practical things that we should think about?
Yeah. Well, I think it's, and speaking even from personal experience, I think, when there's a relational conflict, and I'm thinking especially with, a family member, my first response is I want to defend myself, and I want to totally blame the other person.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like, well, if he or she, would be more like this, or they just can't see it this way, what's wrong with them? Our immediate first thoughts are what? They're towards the other person. That's where the problem lies, right? There couldn't be anything about me that might be, contributing to the situation. And so I think this whole idea of self-awareness that we've touched on before is a key part of it. And again, this is not, self-awareness is not excusing the other person from their part. I
Right.
mean, it's but as we talked about too, is that there's so much about the other person I can't control. I can't
Yes.
control what they're going to do with it, how they're going to respond. The only thing I can control is what God shows me that I need to be doing. And so I think that, again, it's back to that openness, that humility, but also the self-awareness of, in a strained relationship. I think what we can do, each of us individually, is first things we can just look at ourselves and just say, okay, is there anything about me that is contributing to this situation, that is contributing to this strained relationship? And if there are some things that God shows us in the midst of that, then I think the first step is we own that. We just own that and say, okay, I'm not perfect. As good as all of our intentions are with relationships, and I think we do have good intentions for the most part, we still don't do it perfectly. And so I think just that openness to just say, okay, there could be something about me, there could be something about my style of relating, there could be something about an attitude that maybe I need to address that would lend towards maybe that relationship getting healed or getting redeemed.
How can you be, how do you do this process of looking at yourself in a broken relationship and realizing your part in it? I mean, immediately when a relationship is broken, you are defensive and also mad. Let's just put that on the table. You're angry, you're defensive. And then it kind of softens, as we talked about, the idea that your anger kind of dissipates, which is important. That's an important step. But this idea that you have to look at yourself and see what you did wrong. Are there questions you should ask yourself, or prayers that you should pray, or people you should talk to help you with that part of the journey?
Yeah, I think that, again, I'm trying to think of my own life. I think it's, I journal,
Yep.
So journaling helps me to process these things. And so, I'll journal about, there might be a strained relationship. And so I'll just journal some things. And I think I start to, again, prayerfully before God, just saying, show me, show me if there are some things that I need to see that I'm not seeing. And then, as those things come to my mind, I'll just, kind of journal them. And that leads to kind of processing, and thinking about, okay, yeah, I probably shouldn't have said this, or maybe I need to go back and apologize for this, that I said. and at least for me, that's kind of the starting point. There's not like 5 questions I think you ask yourself. I think it's just more general of, you know, just again that openness and awareness of, you know, are there things about me I'm not seeing that strain relationships? And by the way, this is where, being in community can really help.
Yes. Hmm.
Like if you, and again, community is not like, you find a stranger on the street and say, hey, is there anything about me that, isn't all that appealing? But it's
I
more of
feel like
some,
you should do that. You should try that. Yeah.
but it's more of, some trusted people that
Right.
who know you, where you know that you're safe with those people, that they're going to accept you, they're going to value you, but they also might see some things that you're not seeing yourself, and they can speak into that and just say, yeah, I've kind of noticed this about you at times, and that could be a way just to, again, kind of shining a light on an area of our lives that we might not be all that in tune with.
In my own experience of broken relationships, and I have some still, I have found that what has helped me is counseling, going to a
Mm-hmm.
very good counselor who can point out and break down what the root cause of the fracture was, and how I contributed to it, and how it speaks to something in my own life that has happened, something in the past, or relationships from my childhood. I have found that it helps to talk to my family members who
Mm-hmm.
know me quite well. And you have to be vulnerable to do that, to say,
Yep.
I'm looking to figure out what I did wrong in this, but they're very often helpful and also happy to tell you what they think. I have found that it does help community in church,
Yeah.
because in my church community, I feel like people are much more open about sharing life's experiences. So therefore, they're open to saying, that's happened to me, or something similar has happened to me. And so all of those factors, all of those people speak into your lives, and then you can finally see that you do need to do that work. You do need to figure out what part of it you played, and how do you not come to the same place again in terms of breaking a relationship, particularly really important relationships.
Yeah.
I
Those are.
like how you mentioned Paul, and Paul says in Romans 12, as far as it depends on you, right?
Mm-hmm.
As far as it depends on you, you need to do what needs to be done to restore that relationship. And you're right, you can't really control the other side. You can't assume that they're going to do the same thing, or that they're going to respond to you. But nevertheless, you have to try. It's worth
Yeah.
trying.
Yeah. I think he says in that verse to, as far as possible, be at peace
Hmm.
with all people.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, a big part of that, just thinking that, you know, one of the things when we were raising our daughter's now 31, which is hard to believe, but I'm not sure where that time went. But I know that, my wife and I had talked early on that it was like, we want to model to her, obviously she's going to see the conflict, because there was conflict in our relationships at times. I mean, we're two human beings, trying to get along with each other. So it's not like you're going to hide the conflict,
Right.
but what we wanted to model to her as well is the resolution of the conflict. And both for her and her, upbringing with her parents, the same for me, my upbringing with my parents, we saw the conflict, but we never saw any resolution.
Mm.
Yeah, we never saw them going, and even if it took place, outside of of our view, but I think a lot of times it didn't, because the conflict continued. Um, but we wanted her to see that. So if we did something that she saw or noticed in a conflict, we would we would go to her and we just would apologize and just say, sorry that, we got into this, but want to let you know that we resolved it. And then even with, you know, sometimes when we would have conflict, even with her or with each other in our family, if we harmed or wronged somebody, we would go to them and we would, talk about it, process it. And then at the end, when it was appropriate, we would ask for forgiveness.
Mhm.
We would just say, I'm sorry I harmed you in that. And I just ask that you would forgive me. And to me, that's part of maybe closing the loop in
Right.
terms of restoring a relationship, or just even restoring a conflict in the relationship, resolving that is I think it's important at times when we own something, when we realize there's something I've done that could have, harmed somebody, or it just could have, um, you know, uh, done something that, was not all that positive to them, that it's good that we own that and we go to them and just say, I'm sorry that I caused this and that I did this. And I just ask that you would forgive me for that.
Again, so critical to be open to apologizing and making amends, whatever is the offense, if it's small or large. I grew up in a family where my parents never apologized for anything they did. I don't think to each other or to us. So
Yeah.
learning that an apology is important, it took a long time to understand why, because they would just sweep the conflict under the rug. And I thought, well, that's just the way you do it. That's the modeling that I got from my parents.
Yeah.
But when you say you're sorry, it's such an important thing for you as well. It's not just the person you're apologizing to,
Right.
it's also for the benefit of you, because it makes you feel like you've brought it to their attention. You've, in humility and in earnestness, said you're sorry, and then you can't really figure, you can't assume that they're going to respond to it, but you feel better. I mean, it's really about you feel better when you apologize to somebody for something that you did, as compared to just leaving it inside your heart, sort of festering and rolling around in there and making you feel bad.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not just feeling better about yourself, but I think it is, also you're realizing perhaps the hurt or the harm that you caused the other person. And when you recognize and realize that, you're probably least likely to do that again, because
That's true.
you've paused long enough to recognize that, oh, my actions or my words or my withdrawal, from a situation, it really did impact the life of this other person that I care about, and that I
Right.
deep down I don't want to hurt, I don't want to harm. And so I think that's part of it as well. Um, and then I think part of it is just, once you deal with it, as in any conflict, then it doesn't hang over you anymore.
It's not a big dark cloud. And
Right.
a lot of times when we get in an argument, we're like, well, that person needs to apologize to me. Like, we're
Yeah.
putting it on them, like
Them.
they need
Mhm.
to apologize. But that doesn't happen very often. What happens more often is that at some point there's a conversation that takes place, and then you're balancing out this effort to be both, kind, and honest, nice and sincere. You're trying to find the words to say, this is how I felt,
Mhm.
and this is my part in it. So it's, what does it look like for somebody to try to have a real conversation with somebody about an offense that's taken place?
Again, it goes back to, I think, one of the things that I think is helpful to practice is, what I've referred to earlier, I think in the podcast, where you own your own experience.
Mhm.
And so it's like, if you sit down to talk about a situation, something that happened, you bring it up, whatever it was, this happened. It may be I yelled at you, or I lost my temper, or, I hung up on you, whatever it might be. You know, I think you go back to that point, and then if each person can just start the conversation by saying, when this happened, this is what I was feeling, this is what I was thinking, this is what was going on inside of me, at that point in time, and hopefully the other person is listening without interrupting, because you're all you're doing is you're simply sharing, this is what was going on in me. You're not evaluating whether it was right or wrong. You're just saying, this is what was going on, and then you let the other person do the same thing. You listen to them, and at the least, what you're doing is you're seeking to understand what life was like from the perspective of the other person in that given moment. And I think that's a lot of times what we miss, in the midst of conflict, is we're only seeing things from our own point of view. And I think what helps is when we can move to that point of going, okay, I need to consider what was going on with them at the time. Maybe when they said that thing to me that hurt me, I mean, maybe they were dealing with their worst possible day ever. Maybe they just gotten some really bad news. Maybe they deep down been wrestling with them. Again, you're seeking to understand life from the perspective of the other person. And I think when we can get to that point, it helps. It's not going to automatically resolve everything, but it certainly is, I think, a necessary first step in resolving any type of tension or conflict.
What a good idea, again, of just going into conflict resolution with the idea of, let's talk about what happened, and here's where I was at with that, what was going on with me that day. It kind of opens the door for the other person to hear some background information that maybe they didn't know about, and also allows them to share that background information if they're willing to.
Right.
And of course, we did talk about the focus of forgiveness in these conversations, and trying to reach real forgiveness or meaningful forgiveness, not just a platitude, well, I'm sorry, but trying to reach where we really feel as though going forward is an option if that's what both parties want. So how do you define real forgiveness when there's offense, and why does it matter?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. How do you find forgiveness? And, as I've thought about this quite a bit, I think, forgiveness comes down, I think, to releasing the control or the grip that another person has on you. Because if we don't forgive someone, we basically allow that person to have a control over our lives, because we're constantly thinking about it. We're constantly angry at them. In other words, we're giving that person so much power over our own lives that's robbing us of the energy and life that we are meant to have. And so I think forgiveness is coming to a point of saying, okay, I can forgive you. I won't hold a grudge against you. I'll forgive you for the harm you caused me, regardless of what the intent was. In doing so, is I release that grip that has had on my life, coming to that point. And I think it's understanding that, forgiveness means I'm not going to hold that grudge against the person moving forward. I'm not going to hold it against them, but I'm going to release that. And so I think that's a part of forgiveness. I think a common myth with forgiveness is like, we think that to really forgive a person, we have to forget what they've done or forget the harm that they cause us. And that's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not forgetting. We may never forget what happened. We may never forget the situation or even the injury or the harm that they caused us. But again, we can you know, uh, forgive them for their actions and what they did against us, which then allows us to move on in not just in that relationship, but I think in life in general.
Is there ever a time in which you can forgive uh, and not forget? I mean, does it make sense sometimes to forgive, even if you can't forget, and then remove yourself from the relationship so that it's not constantly
Hmm.
something you're remembering? I think I probably struggle with that. Like, I have forgiven for things that have happened, but I haven't forgotten.
Hmm.
And when I see that person, I still remember it, and I struggle with that.
Hmm.
How do you overcome that?
Yeah. Um, it might just be that tension you have to deal with,
Yeah.
because of the forgetting. And I had a situation where I was, until I came to a point where I could forgive the person, I was dreading running into them. That I might see them at the grocery store, I might see them out and about. You know, and it was a situation where it's like I felt like I hadn't done anything that was wrong in the situation, but as a way that the person had chosen to react, without probably fully understanding what was going on with me. And it was hard because I felt like I had done some things to attempt to bring about the forgiveness, but there wasn't necessarily a receptiveness on the part of the other person. And so that hung over me for months, you know, and it just was this like a dark cloud that was hanging over me. Uh, and I just had to come to the point of just going, okay, I can't control the other person, but I can just say in my heart, okay, I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to release this, put it into the Lord's arms. He can take care of them, in due time. But I'm able to release that, kind of overhanging dark cloud. Um, but it's not like I was going to forget, but it did allow me that if I was to run into this person now and see them, I would be okay. I would be like, okay, it's like we, you know, had a disagreement. Maybe it didn't get resolved fully the way I wanted to, but I been able to, move on from that.
Fun. Um, Good idea. In my own experience, it depends on the nature of the offense. Like, sometimes it's much easier to forgive and move on. Sometimes it's much more difficult to do that. And
Hmm.
in those situations, I have found that you have to really surrender it to the Lord and let Him work ahead of you. And that's Him working on my heart and working on the other person's heart, because my timing might be, okay, I'm ready for this relationship to move forward. And the other person might be, well, I'm not quite ready. So surrender it to the Lord really completely. And also recognizing that conflict is a part of the Lord's plan for us. Like, being in a relationship, conflict teaches us something that the Lord wants us to know. So we can look at it as an opportunity to learn more about ourselves and more about forgiveness and the importance of it.
Yeah.
But all forgiveness needs a starting point, like a point where you have forgiven the person. So what is a small step in the right direction when it comes to resolving a relationship conflict?
As you were sharing that, about what we refer to as the Lord's Prayer, in Matthew chapter 6, where basically he's teaching the disciples how to pray, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's included as part of that prayer, forgive us our trespasses or our sins as we forgive
Forgive.
others, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and it's interesting that of all the things that Jesus could have included in that instructional prayer, if you will, why does he include forgiveness? Because he knew we were going to need it, experience it ourselves, but also to be able to extend that to others as well. And I think it goes back to what you said, Sandy, is that, you know, conflict is inevitable. You know,
It is.
as human beings and be involved in human relationships, conflict is inevitable. And it doesn't matter whether it's at the workplace, whether it's with a friend, whether it's with your spouse, with your kids, it's just inevitable. It's going to happen. You know, and so this idea of needing to get into a rhythm of, you know, extending forgiveness to others, but I think also accepting and receiving the forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we didn't really touch on this, but I think, you know, for me personally, I struggle more with forgiving myself than I do with forgiving others. You know, and because you know, I would call myself a recovering perfectionist. You know, and but it's just kind of like, you know, I put these standards on myself of thinking, oh, I should never harm anybody. I should never do anything that's going to cause, you know, relational strife or conflict. And of course, I'm not going to do that perfectly, right? Um, and when I blow it, when I mess up, you know, whether it's my wife or my daughter or anyone else, they can say to me, "Hey, I forgive you. You know, it's okay. Let's move on." You know, but then I struggle with forgiving myself, which is really, when you think about it, when you struggle to forgive yourself, it's kind of like, well, am I saying at some level God's grace and forgiveness is not good enough for me? You know, that I'm not accepting His grace and forgiveness, you know, not accepting His death on the cross and what He did to provide that grace and forgiveness for me, and I need to, you know, accept that and appropriate it to myself. And so that I think that's, you know, interesting, you know, that at least for me, that tends to be more the struggle.
Forgiving yourself is difficult because if you've taken an action that harms somebody, I kind of feel like I must be a disappointment in the eyes of the Lord, or that I
Mm-hmm.
did something I know He wouldn't want me to have done. I want to be obedient. So harming somebody feels like disobedience. Um, Asking for forgiveness from that person is important. Probably asking for forgiveness from the Lord too, and recognizing you are human. As you mentioned, that we have both natures inside us. I think that Jesus knows that better than anybody. So maybe that's why He put that in the Lord's Prayer, is that the need for forgiveness is always going to be there because of our dual nature. And
Yeah,
we have to get very good at it. We have to get very good at forgiving people,
yeah,
accepting their forgiveness, and forgiving ourselves. Otherwise, we're in a position of being in a stranglehold. We're
yeah,
not releasing ourselves to move forward for what the Lord wants for our life. We're stuck in a situation where we can't move forward.
hmm,
And that's always a mistake because the Lord has great plans for our lives. So
yeah,
um,
yeah.
it's
I
important.
agree. It's very important. You know, you just think about the world that we live in. I mean, if we aren't able to forgive, you know, even to forgive, you know, people who make decisions that we have no influence on, no input on, but they affect us. And
Yes.
they might affect us in a negative way. You know, they might affect us in a way that's going to make it more difficult, you know, to live out our you know, Christian values and convictions and beliefs. You know, and it's kind of like, well, we can go through life the whole time just being angry and mad, you know, and blaming them for whatever, or we can just say, okay, God, beyond my control, I release this. You know, I'm not
Yes.
going to hold a grudge against those people or that group of people or whatever it is. I can release that into His sovereign control and care. And I think that that's a part of that forgiveness, is just that ability to release that, you know, into the hands of the Lord.
I don't know why people want to live in a constant mode of anger and feeling like they've been offended. I'm not sure what they get from that. To me, it feels very confusing. Like you're not living in a state of peace, which is what we all
Mhm.
want. You yourself are not living in a state of peace because you're being so judgmental and also bossy. Um, and
Yeah.
I don't know that would be like if you live there long term, because I try not to, but I would think that you just end up with a heart that's just so suffering and struggling. And around you, you're presenting that energy to people around you. It's almost like you're putting yourself in a sort of a prison of your own design.
Yeah. And I mean, if you read things online, I mean, you'll see there's all kinds of, adverse health effects, that if you live in that state where you're constantly angry or you're constantly stressed or you're constantly, holding something against another person. I mean, there's health effects to that. It's not going to be good. And then also, it's not good for our soul. It's not good for our spirit, when we choose to live in that way.
We have to let the Lord break those chains and move forward in a different way. But,
Yeah.
What could somebody do this week? One step that they could take to restore a relationship in your mind. Give us some practical tips.
Well, I think reach out to the person, you know, uh, and just say, you know what, there's been something there. It's not good. We know it's not good, but we don't need it to be this way moving forward. And so I think first step would be just take the initiative. I think a lot of times when we get into conflict, and I know there's with my wife and I, we from the first day we were married, we took, that passage in Ephesians 4, literally about don't let the sun go down on your anger.
How's that working for you?
Yeah. And I can tell you how many times we've been laying in bed at night, with backs to each other, knowing that there's some type of rift. It feels like there's this canyon between the two of you, even though sometimes it's only like, a foot or something. And I mean, I'm laying there and I'm just going, well, I'm not going to be the first one to say anything. you know, she's the one that did this. She needs to be the first one to
Oh, true.
respond. I mean, it's like we knew we've been there, right? You know,
Yeah.
and even with other relationships, it's like something happens and we're sitting there, we're like, well, they're the one that did it. I'm not going to be the first one to reach out. It's like, well, what if you were the first one to reach out? What if you took the initiative to step across the divide, if you will, and just reach out to the person and just say, "Hey, can we talk?" That might be the very first practice. And by the way, that might be the most difficult step because it feels risky. It feels scary. But I think it's the thing that God asks us to do is just say, "Okay, I'll take the initiative to reach out for the purpose of I just want to talk with the hope of restoring, reconciling whatever it is that needs to take place."
Feels like a step of obedience to the Lord, and that's what he wants us to do. And so
Yeah,
sometimes when I'm in that position, if I can't do it for myself, I do it for him. I'll say,
yeah,
I know this is what he wants me to do, so I'm going to do that. And
yeah.
then let's see what happens. And when I've done that, it's always been a positive outcome.
Hmm.
So it should be less hard to do over time.
Yeah, yeah,
And now in our marriage, for Rich and I, we overcome those little things much quicker than early on in the marriage because it's like, okay, moving on, let's just put that to bed and let's move
yeah.
on because it's just not worth spending days
Right.
angry at each other. It just takes too much energy to
Yeah.
do that.
And it may be too that you get into a situation, even if you take that next step, you reach out and you have the conversation, with someone, you may have to come to a point where you just say, okay, we'll agree to disagree,
Yes.
and
Hmm.
that's okay. If
It
you
is.
agree to disagree, just kind of saying, well, you may see it from a different perspective. I'm seeing it from this perspective, and we may not ever totally agree on it. But is it okay if we just say we'll agree to disagree, but we'll be able to move on in the relationship, and knowing that we're not feeling any ill intent towards each other. We're not holding anything against each other. And it just kind of clears the air where you can move ahead.
I like that. That's a very That's a very good practical thing to practice. But I do think that real restoration or healing doesn't happen in one leap. It takes time and effort
Yeah.
to heal a fractured relationship. Probably much longer than we really think it should, but it does take a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't heal anything if you don't take that first step, or if you don't want it to be healed. As
Right.
you have said, if you don't want to come to the table,
Yeah.
it's never going to happen. But I love all of that we've talked about today, because I'm learning a lot about what I need to do. So I got to get busy this week.
So do I.
Make phone calls, sending out some emails, filling out a few texts, and
As we talked
see.
before, it's easy to talk about these things, but it's, even for me, it's like I'm sitting, I'm going, okay, I need to go do this. If I need to go back to my wife about something that happened last night, and deal with it, So it's just like
Deal with it.
we
Just deal
constantly
with it.
need the reminders, and always too, you think about Paul's letters to the churches. I mean, the occasion for him writing those letters to the churches was mostly to deal with conflict. It was to deal with relational conflict, things that were going on in the church that shouldn't have been going on, people relating in ways that they shouldn't have been relating. And that's why he writes the letters, and he deals with those specific situations. And that's why we get so much of our, healthy relational practices come from the epistles, from the things that, Paul instructed the church in terms of how they were to relate to one another, and also how they would relate to God. And so, but I also think, Paul was also one that said, why? He says, I do the things I don't want to do.
Yeah.
I haven't arrived yet, so even Paul was not perfect. He was in that process of maturing, growing. And so I think we can take comfort in that, and knowing that none of us are perfect, but we still want to do the things that God asks us to do, and that is to move towards, those healthy, vibrant relationships that are outlined in Scripture. And even as we go back to that Romans verse, so that we can, as far as possible, be at peace, be at harmony with everybody else.
That is the goal, and it is a wonderful goal. And,
Hmm.
I need to work on it all the time. But I would like to just achieve it and stay there. I wonder if that's
It
possible.
would be
That would be
nice,
so
wouldn't
good.
it?
It would be so great.
I
I
think
love the
that's
idea of it.
yeah. I
Well,
think
Mark, thank you so much
that's called heaven
yeah. We
when,
think
when that
the
will
place
work
where
that
we
way.
find
Yeah,
peace all the time is in heaven.
yeah,
I wonder how that will be if we're in a constant state of peace. We're so not used to that.
yeah.
It's going to be different and good, though, right? So,
Yes.
Mark, thank you so much for all your time talking about relationships and how we need to respond to relationships in order to make them better, even when they're messy and we don't want to. Such great wisdom coming from somebody who's worked with people for so many years on this very thing. So I appreciate your time, and I just pray that people will take this information and start something up, start the conversation, make the call as you suggested, and see what comes of it, because I do believe God honors our efforts to restore relationships. So
Yeah, I
thank you
agree.
very much. Until
Yes.
next time, you have a great day. Take
Thanks,
care.
Sandy. Thanks. Great to be with you.